everyone. I'm Rachel here with Ari, and we're your hosts for the Merry Writer podcast. This week, we're on episode 232, asking our guest, what do creative writers need to learn? Before we dive into the topic, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening if you haven't already. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with friends and feel free to write a review.
Now, please help us welcome our guest, Jason Harris, to the show. Jason, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you on the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Appreciate it.
Before we go further into the topic, would you like to tell everyone a bit about your teaching creative writing background?
Sure. Definitely always been interested in creative writing once I learned there were such things. I think I remember around age 11 or so, not being happy about having to write poems about leaves, but it got more interesting when I heard about things like, demons and Dante's Inferno and that sort of thing, right? But I turned more towards prose. When I went to undergrad, it was at University of California, Santa Barbara, where they have a special division called the College of Creative Studies, where I was able to take creative writing classes in addition to literature. Though I did my Ph.D. At University of Washington in English literature, I was continuing to work on creative writing. But from those studies emerged a critical book actually called Folklore and the Fantastic in 19th century British fiction, actually. And folklore sort of also related to my interest in creative writing because of all the storytelling elements, all the motifs. But it wasn't until actually 2014 when I had actually resigned from working at Florida Tech that I went back to pursue an MFA in fiction. In between, I'd also taken some screenwriting classes and some fiction seminars from instructors that who offered courses like in the summer and so forth. So Bowling Green State University is where I did my MFA. I got to teach creative writing while I was there, and then came to Texas A&M in 2014, right after the conclusion of that MFA program, and have been teaching everything from a kind of introductory multi-genre course to long-form fiction, focusing also in other classes on the short story and even particular sort of approaches to the short story, like sort of weird, uncanny fiction, and also working with students on creative thesis projects, everything from poetry and short story collections to novels and scripts and so forth. So I've been able to do quite a variety for creative instruction, which has been very, very interesting.
You're busy. My goodness.
Right.
That's actually really amazing, all of the stuff that you've done. And I love your passion for it. Wow.
Oh, appreciate it.
That's great.
In fact, got a couple weeks semi-break, and then a summer session starts up, in fact, with some creative thesis students. So the process continues. We kind of start them up in the summer, and then they continue their longer projects through the fall and spring semesters. And there was some great work that's come out of there. So it's always good to be inspired by your students' work.
No, that is incredible. I think because you were going through the different things that you teach and that, and it's like looking back at when, years and years ago when I was still at college and school. Yeah, you were lucky if you got a creative writing class that they actually taught you something creative, So the idea that you're doing all these different things and teaching different levels is not just how to write this. It's long form, short form poetry. That's impressive so well. I love it. Seriously.
Yeah, of course, when you have long form, there's more to read, and they don't necessarily produce an entire novel during that class, but they'll share several chapters and get a chance to revise and so forth. There's sometimes the challenge that not everybody stays on the schedule, which can be difficult, right? Like, when's that chapter coming in? Where's that? That occasionally happens.
I mean, we all know as writers, deadlines, they're just, they just go along in the wind. We don't worry about deadlines.
Right. Everybody's got a different process. I had an instructor made the point that although everybody, urges you to write every day, you can also write with a binge approach. You're sort of like, okay, finally here's summer. Okay, right. Go away for a weekend somewhere. Right. So you don't have to be always buried in the shame of not having your, 1,000 words a day or whatever it might be. Different ways of finding it out. And could even say that when you're maybe not physically writing, you're kind of incubating, you're thinking about it, you're taking notes. So a lot happens internally first. So not being burdened with too much writer's guilt, I think, can be good, but just enough to sort of prod you with the, a little bit of a few pitchforks of urgency from the demons inside, but otherwise not to be too ashamed or guilty about what you haven't done yet or what you haven't finished, but keep going always.
See, I feel validated now because I much prefer a binge approach because I can't always remember to sit down and write every day, but I am very much the deadline's coming. Okay, 8,000 words, there it is. With with the deadline pressure at the back of you is great. But yeah, I think especially because there's all this write every day, and I said like write 1,000 words. And I think it was Sir Terry Pratchett who apparently wrote 200 words a day. That was it, just 200. And he managed to write his whole thing. And I thought, yeah, I can manage that. And then I'd forget for like 4 days. And then I'd be like, I've got to catch up. So then it's just like, you know what? Binge writing better.
Right. There's always people who have the incredibly impressive, amazing disciplined schedules, whether they're writing under terrible conditions of duress, like Solzhenitsyn, or like Trollope writing in the morning every day and still having amazing social life later in the day. And but not everybody has that discipline or that schedule necessarily available. So you fit it in where you can ultimately.
Yeah, I was just going to say, you kind of need to find out what works for you, and things are going to change down the road as your life change and other things change and things like that. But it sounds like at the very least, they get the tools that they need to get started and to keep going whenever that might be, whether it's for a deadline or not. So with that said, in your opinion, would writers benefit from getting a creative writing degree?
Yeah, I would say yes, if possible. For one big reason, just related to what we're talking about, it does put the writing into the forefront of your life, where you have then time set aside specifically for it. You also have people in a group that now have to read it too, right? There's no longer waiting for someone to get back to you, right, on comments on your novel or your short story, or perhaps a little bit of ambivalence coming from friends and family who aren't sure what cords of connection may be severed if they give you their honest opinion, right? So it's very useful to have that constructive feedback, have the in the environment of getting different strategies and approaches, and reading a variety of different models of writing. Writers can be so opinionated. Eventually you may start to hear everybody you meet sort of imagine them in your head later on when you've written a draft. What would so and so say about this? And so it's a good experience that way. Just the range of things, the opportunity, and if you're lucky enough to be with writing instructors whose work you also like and enjoy, and even if you don't necessarily, there's things you'll be able to learn from it, right? Understand the difference between what happens in a first draft versus something that's polished enough for publication. Becoming your own best editor, ultimately very important as well. So I would recommend it, but it's not a necessity, right? Because we know that people from all sorts of situations of life have been able to be writers. But if it's an option in someone's life to pursue, it's a good one. Conferences, if you can do that, or kind of like a writer's retreat, online programs, wherever you can get that feedback and have that accountability also is very helpful for writing schedules. And getting you out of your comfort zone is important too. That's one of the reasons why in the introductory course I squeeze in as many genres as possible. Like often instructors may just do some poetry, do some fiction, but I also get some creative nonfiction in there. They've got to write a scene for a stage play. They need to do a short screenplay, and of course some fiction. So in other words, they may not have wanted to do all that, but by the end of the course, they'll have different techniques, right? And I've seen a range of different ways of thinking about writing, emphasis on the drama, on the lyricism, the language, different kind of structure in a poem versus, a prose piece, the use of dialogue, but not relying upon dialogue as exposition, all sorts of different things that can come up. And learning, for instance, in screenwriting, where you have to be so concise in your descriptions. You have these small paragraphs, often focused on just, one image or action, and getting used to that versus the more expansiveness you can do, in a novel, where people can integrate all sorts of forms, everything from a PowerPoint presentation, text messages and journal entries and letters, and also I'll teach students flash fiction as well, where they have to do a shorter piece, 1,000 words or fewer, because that's also very helpful to sort of really focus on what's truly essential in this piece, right? To propel it forward, to be vivid enough, yet concise enough, because on one hand, You want to elaborate, right, and be detailed. On the other hand, you don't want any extraneous words that are working against you and drowning you down in the sea of inarticulation, right, or whatever it might be. We find ourselves in knots of all these different things we're trying to do at once, but to focus on one element at a time, get all the words out and cut back.
Where were you when I was in school? I would much rather take a class from you.
What was your writing class experience like?
I got my degree in English studies with a concentration of creative writing, and I did not have a good experience. I don't know if I just went to the wrong school or what, but I took a short story writing course, and I was really excited because it was short story writing. So I thought I was going to learn how to write a short story, and I'd be writing short stories. Every single week, we read a new short story from an author and analyzed the crap out of it. And I was like, this isn't what I wanted. I know it's important.
So
but I'm
did
like,
you share your own writing in that class?
no.
Really?
The professor wasn't even like present.
Oh, wow. Well, that sounds like false advertising.
Yeah, it was so bad. But I really enjoy how you discuss all the different ranges of writing, because whether well, no, let me back up. I like how you mentioned that it's not necessary for you to get a creative writing degree, because you don't need a degree to be a writer or an author. But it's so good to have in your back pocket, because you do learn so many things with the different genres and just the different types. And I love how you go about like screenplays and scripts and poetry, flash fiction, short stories, and you just like, it's a whole spectrum. And I remember when I wanted to be a writer, I just thought I'm going to be an author, and that was it. But I didn't realize that writing is such an umbrella term. You can be an editor, you could be a journalist, you could be a blogger, you can be a ghostwriter, anything and everything. There's so many different opportunities. And if you get a creative writing degree, you can explore those opportunities and narrow down what you really want, and also what you really enjoy and what you're better at. Because some people are better at writing poetry than novels.
And that can change over time too. What you're saying reminds me of when I was in Ohio, one of the writers got to see at one point was George Saunders, who visited for a talk in Toledo. And at the time, he was a short story writer, and he had talked about how he had attempted a novel, and he said it was kind of a bad James Joycean thing, and he realized his limits. But then several years later, he published Lincoln in the Bardo, a novel, a very creative approach to a novel, which has the different voices of the dead integrated and so forth. But there he was, someone who was already, was well known, well published, and had an idea about his limitations, which turned out not to be correct. So whatever limits people think about their writing can, should change eventually, probably, right? Whatever you need to believe at the moment to get something done. If you don't want to be distracted by the idea that you're a novelist and a short story writer, but just a short story writer right now, fine. But then be open to later on, perhaps you're ready to try that novel, get it out of the drawer, or whatever the case may be.
I think that's it though, isn't it? It's you go into things and you kind of, your limitations, and then you kind of get sucked into them. I mean, I've always been like, well, I have to write novel length and it has to be like a series because I can't condense ideas into one book. And yet the things I've been published for are short stories. And that was only because someone came over and said, do you want to try this short story for this anthology? And it was like, oh, I don't think I can do that. I said, well, just try. And then I did, and it worked. But it's so strange because I still consider myself, no, it's a novel. I would always be writing novels, not short stories and everything. And just circling back round to the specific question, one thing I noticed when you said, like, you're working in a class with a group of people, that is so important, because the writing industry, it's a little bit lonely because you're usually writing on your own. And yes, we've got the internet, and yes, we've got all these places you can meet people. But if you're doing a creative writing degree and you're with a lot of other people who are there to learn and to develop, you've already built yourself a little bit of a network. And if some people in that class are better at writing description, and some people are better at writing dialogue, and some people are better at writing short stories, everything, you've got a nice little pot of people who are sharing ideas and feedback and learning from each other. And I think we sometimes forget how important networking is. I hate that term, networking. It sounds so buzzwordy for business, but you know what I mean? Kind of like a community of writers as well as the teacher who assists. And also, I think with a degree, I say this as someone who does not have a creative writing degree, but I can imagine it does offer a little bit of validity. I am well aware of people in my life who consider writing a phase. It's not important. It's not. But if you pull out a degree going, I have a creative writing degree, I can imagine there is a bit more validity to it, a bit more like, oh, they're going to be a writer. Yeah, well, they've got a degree in creative writing. I can see why they would go to that. I'm not sure, maybe not, but I could imagine that.
It'll depend who you talk to, right? So it varies. I remember going to actually a video game developing conference back in the early 2000s, and for one company there was they felt like writers were a dime a dozen, and they wanted someone to be a programmer before they were working as a writer for them. Now, some people would argue that's part of the problems with some video games, that maybe they're not putting enough focus on the writing and storytelling, or has been the case. But other hand, there were others later on who I remember were recruiting from popular bestsellers like Tom Clancy and others. So it does vary, right? Some people think it's anybody can do it sort of thing, and may not think much of the degree either. On the other hand, it does mean at least that you've finished some kind of major project by the time you finish something like an MFA or a Ph.D. And then usually what you're doing is you're putting together what hopefully will become a publishable body of work. You may continue to work on it various ways, but it shows a commitment to the task and a commitment to the craft ultimately, that you have to put ahead of maybe a sense of ego or what you thought you were going to work on necessarily, and a willingness for the story or the poem to become what it sort of needs to be, or maybe your preconceptions about it, which involves a kind of letting go at a certain point. Then, of course, you come back years later and you keep changing things. In fact, yeah, I forget her name right now, but there was a writer who visited several years back, who pointed out she was always uncomfortable reading her work to an audience because she said invariably book is published, she'd notice things she wanted to change, right? So other people are better at letting go, like, okay, this is it, and we'll read this and move on.
Well, that's just it. You mentioned the commitment, and I think that kind of goes along with what Ari said about the being valid. I'm not even going to try to pronounce it. Because if you have that degree, it just shows that I'm not saying that if you don't have a degree, you don't care, but having the degree shows that you're willing to learn more, and that that things change, that the rules can vary, and that there are different ways to write and different things to write. And so that by taking a class here and there or getting a full degree, it shows that you're really passionate about it and you want to learn more. It's like you're eager, basically what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and the commitment and the willingness to revise is very important over time. I remember as an undergraduate, often I wasn't interested in going to revise so much. I'd rather just write a whole new story because there were a bunch of ideas that were popping up, and it just often felt, oh, I did that. But later on, in the greater middle-aged maturity, right, understood the need for revision. Yes, that's really what often makes the difference between what gets published and not. And what you thought maybe you had on the page wasn't quite there, and there's a gap probably between your conception of this and how it's really articulated. Sentences here could probably be more impactful and clearer, and pacing could be better, and maybe you should just take out the whole first paragraph or page, or start in the middle, all those kind of things. And then you just have to admit, yes, maybe so, and let's try that. So yes, the willingness to be ready to change, but be committed to that is very important. Not set in stone. A lot of people, especially when they're young, like the idea that it can just be sort of visited upon you. And then being a better writer means your first draft will just be immaculate, amazing, Pulitzer Prize winning. But no, it's really a commitment to the process, the methods, the willingness to see things afresh and change what needs to be changed to make it more interesting and compelling. It might not just be one way, right? It may be different pathways you can take, and then decide which is going to fit most interestingly.
Yeah, I definitely get that. I recently, when I was trying to work through my one of my current manuscripts, and nothing was working, I was getting very frustrated. And it took about 2 months to figure out I needed to take like 3 chapters out. That I was literally trying to put the square peg in the round hole. And it was like, I really liked these chapters. I really wanted them in. The whole scenes were just great. And it was just getting awkward. And I just kept leaving it and coming back to it and leaving it and coming back to it, kind of fresh eyes. And it took ages to go like, you know what? The whole thing's just got to go. It's not helpful. It's not working. It's slowing the flow down. But I know if it had been years ago, I would have probably just put the whole manuscript aside and never gone back to it because, well, I can't figure it out yet. Rather than think, actually, I have to sacrifice those chapters. They don't work. They're just not helping. And I'm wasting my time trying to make them fit. Very painful.
Yes, no, I hear you on that. In the novella that I did, Master of Rods and Strings, there was several scenes where it took place in a different country, and I eventually realized it's better to concentrate it all in France, actually, for the atmosphere, the culture. So not have a trip to Wisconsin and the cranberry bog, as I had at one point with hitchhiking around and getting into trouble. And no, we'll just leave that all out. It was a needless distraction. But did you find yourself taking those chapters and setting them aside in a file that you might revisit for maybe another work or a sequel, or what did you do with them after you took them out?
I do not throw anything. I am every now and then I will delete stuff, but 90% of the time I take things out because I either decide it will be added as a bonus somewhere, you know, like maybe if I share it with our newsletter people and say like, hey, here's a bonus chapter that you'll never get to see. It's like, wow. Or it's something I could probably rework into the next book as either a flashback or it actually fits better in the next book. But yeah, I always keep things because you just never know. You never know what somebody would want to see. Some of my newsletter subscribers, they like these like extra little scenes. They're deleted scenes. We've all seen it on DVDs. You know, you have the deleted scenes. You'll never, and people love watching those. People love seeing what was cut out and it's like, oh, would it have worked? The worst thing you can have is someone saying, oh, I really wish you'd kept it in. It would have worked. It's like, no, don't say that.
Yeah, and that's useful for teaching purposes too, to share with somebody else, like, okay, I did take this out, cut this ending, whatever it might be. And also a good reminder that we shouldn't throw anything into flames anymore, right? And with all these various ways of saving things, save them, you know, set it aside and save it.
And back up your stuff. Don't delete it and then back it up so that it doesn't get deleted on its own.
Yeah, I've gotten into the habit of emailing myself latest drafts just in case, you know, a hard drive goes bad, and doing the cloud and other things. But yeah, multiple ways of backing up, got to do it. I think we probably all have had those very frustrating, infuriating losses of computer files at some point.
Painfully so. Okay, I'm going to pull us back to our main topic because I realized we kind of stretched off, which is good. As someone who hasn't got a creative writing degree, what does a typical lesson plan look like for a creative writing course for anyone who hasn't done it and would like to think about it?
It varies, you know, on the level of the class, but typically, and I'll do this on mobile levels, there will be sort of a workshop component. Usually with some preliminary, you know, exercises sort of building up. So for instance, in like the short story unit, I would start with, you know, suggesting students, you know, figure out who are the primary characters, you know, what's the conflict, and then sharing first sentences. I would suggest, you know, 6 different possible first sentences from 6 different story possibilities. And then we'd sort of go through what their favorites are and hear people critique them and talk about, okay, let's see what's interesting here. Is there a character? Is there some sort of motivation cropping up? Is there a setting? Is there a, you know, how's the voice? All those things. And then a first draft for sharing and workshop, where then people would do these little peer review sheets I typically would make, where they give feedback of a range of things, everything from what they felt most compelling, what they were maybe hoping for in the story, you know, matters of format, matters of, you know, in terms of the characters, was there enough at stake for them? Were they challenged enough? Is it, you know, meaningful, interesting opposition and struggles, all those kinds of things. And then after they've had feedback from other students, both talking in the class, but also in written form for further reflection, the students will, by the end of the semester, will revise their work, revise, you know, that story, for instance, along with some others, and also have a reflection statement where they talk about how do they decide on the changes they made. They'll have to address some of the feedback they got. They're not forced to use it, but to talk about their process of thinking it through. Like maybe somebody said, you should just make it all in, you know, third person omniscient or something. And maybe they said, well, you know, actually, I did decide to change it from first person, but the third person close consciousness, right? Or something, right? Right. So maybe a input helped them make a decision that was productive in some ways. And also any other additional writing that we've read, you know, from various authors that maybe gave them some interesting ideas on techniques. Sometimes students are a little reticent perhaps to use fragments because it's been drilled into them in composition classes like void fragments, but you know, fragments can be useful for flashes of thought and images and dialogue, right? So whatever the case may be in their process reflecting on it, they'll have to make both sort of micro, sort of sentence level changes, as well as macro, you know, larger sort of structural changes, beginnings, endings, maybe getting rid of a character, merging characters, having the motivation change, maybe change your point of view character. Maybe this person comes to failure instead of success, or there's complications from the success, whatever it might be, right? Just different ways of rethinking the story in a major way. And even if it's not what they ultimately feel satisfied with, it shows them some of the different choices and power they have of shaping something as a writer and a reviser. And they can always go on after the course too for further development. So that's sort of some of the things that tend to be a feature of these classes. So being ready to be both, you know, generous and respectful with critiques, both, you know, receiving it, not, for instance, to start interrupting people and saying, well, what I tried to do and you didn't understand because you're not as brilliant, you know, whatever. Like, don't be that person, right? It's fine to sort of talk about some of the aims of the story. And if maybe somebody hasn't given feedback on specific areas they were hoping to hear, to raise that. Well, also I was wondering, you know, what did you think of A, B, and C? Those kind of things, right? But usually we'll have the writer of the story largely wait to hear some of the feedback, but also maybe to have included some questions that other students can have thought about that would be particularly useful to the writer. So they're not necessarily stuck in the position of, here I am, you know, upon the cross, right, taking the arrows, but also really hopefully people bring in, you know, helpful, you know, telescopes and microscopes and different ways of relating to the work, different lenses to think about it, you know. But you know, it's always going to be a somewhat painful process because, you know, you've spent this energy, you've offered probably some, you know, very vivid feelings, even if it's fully fictional. Probably some of the feelings come from the writer, you know, in terms empathetically, and having created something, there's going to be vulnerability, and so you know, it can be difficult sometimes to negotiate through that, particularly the first time for someone maybe who hasn't been in a class or a workshop group or a writing group. But it's worth it in the long run, whatever the sensitivities might be. And sometimes it turns out that some of the things that somebody says that might really may rankle because there's some recognition like, yeah, that character wouldn't have done that, or you know, made it too easy for them, or whatever the case may be, you know. Other hand, it may be that you have a sort of a gut vision that nobody quite got. It may be possible, right? And then you just have to think more about, okay, well, how do I manifest that more in the revision? So an openness to what people say, but also a willingness to have, you know, the inner endurance to be true to the vision you have for the story, but also additional openness to maybe sort of see the story with new eyes and redirect it somewhere where maybe you initially didn't think it might go. So having, I'd say, the openness, the energy, the endurance, the flexibility, the stick-to-itiveness, all those things for being in a form of class for creative writing input is, you know, useful attitudes to have, and will ultimately be productive for people who I think accept that and are ready for it.
I have to say, I think it's when you said, oh yeah, you know, you'll be reading it out, and the first thing I thought was, oh God, no. But again, that's probably my anxiety, but I think it's important.
Reading your own story aloud?
Yeah, oh yeah, no, that's
so the different. So sometimes an instructor might. I had one, for instance, before who would not even tell people whose story was going to be discussed, and they wouldn't even read them in advance. They would just start reading a story, and people would listen. It was kind of an illusion, though, anonymity, because the person who wrote it would probably not say anything, right? And also, that's not always feasible, just given the sheer, the time. It can take a whole hour to read one person's story. But yeah, but having some aspects of reading aloud is really helpful. And we do it for the flash fiction, for instance. I make sure everyone in the story gets read aloud by somebody other than the author. So the author can hear how, for someone who didn't write the story, the words seem to be intended to be, articulated. And it might be different than what the author hears in their head. So that's useful, I think. And often we catch things when something is read aloud. Like maybe it's just, there's a word, it's a fine word in the context of that sentence, but it rhymes with one that comes up next you didn't intend. Or what do you know, you used it again 2 more sentences down, and suddenly, right, it's sort of diluting the impact. And maybe you didn't realize that until it was read aloud by somebody else. So the sonic level is important, the rhythm, the music of it, all those things. So it's good to have that aspect, certainly. But I'm sorry, I think you were saying something else besides the matter of reading aloud. That
No, but that's because obviously with anxiety, if anyone says, "Oh, read your own stuff aloud," that's terrifying anyway. I think I'd probably be okay to read somebody else's stuff. It's not as opening your heart up and going, "Here, stop me with your thoughts," when you're reading it yourself. But actually, yeah, somebody else reading it would be better. So I think that's not too bad. I don't think. But do you encourage your students when they're doing their critique to definitely talk about the positive and the negative, or is it just mostly about like, "Oh, that's not right," in a nice way?
no, both. Like, in fact, so for the peer review sheets, I'll include questions like, what did you think was the most compelling aspect of the story, right? What interested you the most? What did you feel the most here? What are you hoping, would be the outcome? Those kind of things. In addition to, is there anything that need, greater clarity, and we need to raise the stakes and those kind of things. So it's also, I include some open-ended questions where they can offer anything else they want to say. But yes, they are required actually to say something positive too, right? About what they thought was most interesting or effective. Not just validating to hear that, but then when somebody understands something that was effective, they can think about, well, how can I do more of that, right? So, maybe getting into this character's head with the way the thoughts and feelings were presented. What made that effective? Was it the images? They weren't cliches? Was it the pacing of it? Was it sort of some of the sensory elements of somebody feeling beneath the table, the striations and getting the splinter in the hand at the moment, whatever it might be, right? So it's important to tell people what's effective too that they do. I have heard that kind of thing for myself. My very first story, actually, as an undergrad, I was told, when a writer writes a story like this, the good thing is that they can go back and write something else. This entire story is a mistake. So, so I've already heard some, I think, the worst that you can hear, as a freshman when I was, by the end of the semester, it got better. But yeah, I wouldn't do that to my students.
But I mean, that is kind of the point. You're supposed to improve by the end of the semester. I used to be part of a writers group, and I remember the host, he told us that if you get 10% of the feedback, if like 10% of the feedback you receive is useful to you, then that's a solid workshop. Would you agree with that? Because ultimately it's your story.
You're saying that he said that there's a problem with the story if it's 10%, or that it's worth it if it's at least 10% that's useful?
No, he was saying that like if like all the feedback that you receive, positive or negative, like ultimately in the end it's your story. Like he was trying to reiterate, like whatever people say to you is not set in stone. You're the author, it's your story. If you agree with 10% at like, maximum of the feedback you receive, then that's a solid workshop and you have good people around you.
I see. Right. So in other words, if at least 10% seems to resonate with the intentions of what the writer was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, again, I don't know if I can put a certain percentage on it. I mean, I think all of it should be listened to. And where there is something that resonates, can certainly be encouraging. I think it's also good to revise with a resistant reader in mind too, not just the ideal one. Have a phase in revision where you're thinking about, okay, well, there might be somebody who, for instance, knows all these references that are in here to, this work or this music or this film or this art or this, subculture and loves it. There might be somebody who doesn't. Are you interested in writing for that person as well? So, I mean, thinking about the audience is definitely important. And sometimes I think that's part of the disparity that might happen in the range of feedback received in a class, that maybe it's partly just who's familiar with the subject matter too. Maybe a genre that the student doesn't typically read. Some people read science fiction, some don't. But I think what you said from that other instructor is good to keep in mind, that if something's resonating, that should be encouraging at least. And if nothing resonates at all, it's definitely a signal that a very hard look needs to be taken again at that story. But yeah, not think of a writing workshop in terms of a popularity contest, but a kind of a testing ground for looking for helpful input. Because if everybody just says, "Oh, that's great, I liked it, I loved it," that's not as helpful really as if somebody talks about, I didn't get a sense of how this character was interacting with their environment. These two people, like, how do they really feel about each other? Is this person lying? That kind of thing, whatever it might be, right? And it's useful to know where somebody might have stopped reading too, if they didn't have to read it, because of course they have to read it in the workshop, and that can be a scary question. Occasionally, that's when I've asked people, like, where would you have stopped reading if you didn't have to read this?
That's good. That's a good one. I never thought to ask that before, because it's true. How many times have you started reading a book and then you've put it down, and maybe you've gone back to it later to give it another shot, but sometimes you're just not in the mood for it and it's like, this isn't for me.
Yeah, or where did you really start paying attention, which is usually when somebody gets into the scene. Like sometimes people have a few too many sort of generalizations to start the story, or too much, sort of background. But once they get into a scene where people are struggling over something, it gets often more interesting.
No, that's all a great point. And yeah, audience is important. And I think when you're in a classroom setting, it helps to have all the like-minded people, despite whether they're writing in the same genres or not. Like, you're all there to learn and improve and support one another. So I think that was a solid answer. Thank you for that. But with all of that said, like, how do you grade a creative assignment, and how can writers do a similar evaluation of their work themselves?
What I do is for the first draft, just for people completing it, I give them full credit. They've done it, right? They did a draft. When it comes to what they turn in for the revision, then it's going to be a bit more rigorous in terms of have they done the micro and macro revisions, and also looking at the writing itself. Does it hopefully avoid cliches, or if it uses a cliche, does it deploy it in a way that's somehow interesting or fresh? Is somebody's consciousness changing over time in the course of the narrative? Are these characters sort of interesting, meaningfully depicted? Are their motivations, clarified where it makes sense to clarify them at least? Is the setting realized? Are people just sort of talking in white space, so we don't have a sense of the setting and the interactions? Could the setting be changed where it is more meaningful? Maybe can become part of their struggles. Have they done sort of writing archaeology? So if we see someone's room, are we just told it's got 4 blue painted walls, or do we see things that help to show us their lives in interesting ways? Is what emerges from sort of the ambivalence and the torment and needs of a character, are they acted upon in some way? Because we don't want to have just people stewing in the bathtubs of discontent, right? But actually going and doing something. Also, we talk about how you don't have to like the main character, right? You don't actually have to like that person, but are they compelling in a way that they are interesting? Are they doing things, right? Are they acting upon what they want, what they fear, what they crave? Or are they forced to, perhaps by circumstances? Like, there's sometimes the idea of the bear at the door, like, okay, you're living your life, but there's a bear at the door, you're gonna do something about it now, right? Or it's through the window, whatever else it may be, or the stranger comes to town, or somebody finds your secrets, whatever the case. Now what do you do? So does the story deal with the issue of why today? Why not yesterday? Why not next week? right? So is there that sense of immediate urgency that was going to interest a reader? So these are some of the questions I ask and think about when evaluating the story. On the sentence level, do we want to read from sentence to sentence? Is it too flat? Do we have these statements where there was this and there was that and was, and it just far too static with the those linking verbs? Or are we offered something, an interesting way of thinking about something that maybe we've witnessed but haven't quite captured yet? I forget the writer. There's a poet who talks about the artichoke as like this many-winged, vegetable, like, and then once you think of it having these little wings, like you'll never not think of it, and so offering maybe some interesting vivid language like that, or something with sort of humor. Humor can be hard to do, but sometimes it navigates around taboos or things we thought about that maybe haven't been quite expressed. I was reading someone's story recently talking about just that awkwardness of when you're having a dental hygienist do weird stuff in your mouth and they're making eye contact with you, and you're trying to, you can't talk to them, and it just described it so well. And in doing that kind of thing, right, can have when captured in a way that's fresh and interesting, can be hilarious, and people who take the time to do that, having the familiar expressed in a way that's startling, but also it resonates, right? That can be as interesting as somebody creating a new monster or something like that, right? So different ways of working with innovation and tradition, and the voice of the writing that comes through, the handling of certainly punctuation, to control your sentences, a sense of knowing how to use the language, all those things. So the larger sort of structural and character-driven issues and plot, as well as the sentence level vividness, articulation, all those kind of things are kind of what we tend to evaluate. And whether, when it came to that revision, did they take meaningful action as opposed to just clinging to what they initially did, pushing aside the feedback from people, or did they really take the time to, okay, I'm going to go ahead and have a different ending to this story, or I'm going to change the location. I'm going to just get rid of this character who was just there as someone to confide in the whole time, and that person is a flat, robotic, oh yes, very interesting. Yes. I think, those characters exist, unfortunately, right? So get rid of them, or have them have an agenda. So, those kind of things, to see if the story grew by the end of the course, and how it grew. Then, not necessarily in length, maybe it became more realized as a shorter story. The person maybe realized they didn't have to have everything sort of tidily wrapped up, but it was implied what would happen once this fateful decision got made, that the commitment was there, and we could feel, and some of the imagery that's given at the end, where things are going from there, watching the grease hardening on the plate or whatever it might be.
Man, you bring up so many good points that, like, all the stuff that you just listed, I'm thinking back to my own novels and I'm like, I don't do that. I don't do that either. My characters, they very are in like a black void. And I tell people that I'm much better at dialogue than I am description. I'm like, they're just sitting in nothing and just do it. Yet they're still investigating a murder, but there's nothing going on around. But yeah, I also like how you mentioned that you also evaluate them on whether or not they utilize the feedback that they receive, because you're also kind of teaching them how to critique other writers, but also to develop that thick skin. So, because, no, not everybody's writing is perfect, especially not during the first and second drafts.
Yeah, definitely. And some things, in those early drafts, maybe kind of placeholders. Like sometimes you have everybody's shrugging, everybody's eye rolling. Go back and look at all those and think, okay,
Now you're calling me out.
well, maybe someone's reaching their pocket and there's, well, who knows what there is. There a gun? Is there a letter? Is there a watch? Is there some heirloom? Is there a pet rock? There might be something there, right, that relates to that character's personality and maybe their intentions, and maybe something else that's going to go off like Chekhov's gun at some point. And it should be hopefully unique to the character. It doesn't have to be that you're you're touching the lightning scar all the time or something over there. But anyway, so yeah, but something that's specific to the character, with the gestures. And again, thinking about making that environment be an interesting crucible where are these people stuck together in a car ride who don't want to be stuck together? Or so things are going to eventually come up where the subtext is going to boil over into a real confrontation. That's something to think about. If you don't have situations like that for pressure cookers, then introduce one. But I think everybody at some point looks at their manuscript like, oh, a lot of white space here. Like these are like disembodied voices. Like this person even looking at the other person, or what are they doing? Or like, what? This comment never got reacted to. It needs a reaction, right?
I feel so cold. It's so funny because one of my manuscripts, my partner was constantly writing, everybody stood. He stood by the door. He stood by the window. It's just like everything, it was over. And then I think everyone was rolling their eyes at one point. But you don't realize that you've used it so many times until somebody else reads it through. And you're just like, oh, wow.
Right. Just call them placeholders and go back and revisit them.
Yeah, it's you just sit there highlighting everything until the page is like, wow, there's about 20 highlights on that one page where everybody was eye rolling. It's just awful.
Yes, or sometimes it just too much water has been secreted from the eyes over time or something, or sweat or whatever it is, and just gotta go back and that. How many times did that happen?
Honestly, you're making me feel like I need to go and do more editing. And the last thing I need right now is more frigging editing, I have to say. This actually leads really good on to the next question. And I'm very interested in the answer to this. What sort of writing exercises or assignments can writers do at home to help them?
There are always a lot of things, and I actually had taken a note and I revised my note earlier. So I think the first one I would suggest is figure out for your protagonists, what is their sort of main mode that they rely upon to engage with others that they feel confident in. Like, is it a sense of humor? Is it their physical strength? Is it appearance? Is it a skill? And then put them in a situation where they've lost that. Maybe they're with an audience that if they're a comedian, the jokes are all going to fall flat. Okay. It's Superman and the kryptonite. Maybe it's somebody who was excellent at one type of music that nobody likes, where they've now gone to, right? Maybe it's their profession that they've got a great sense of identity from, but it doesn't impress the in-laws, whatever it might be. So putting your character in a situation where they cannot rely upon, their greatest asset. Maybe they've lost it entirely. Maybe it's a friend. Maybe they've lost a friend is gone or died. It's that confidant character, whatever it might be. And then see how will they get by? Maybe they will fail. Maybe they'll learn to cope the next time. I think that's a useful exercise for anyone, because it might also help you as a writer think about, have I tested this character enough? And so if you don't have a scene like that, it's something to consider. And it might even be, end up being a short story into itself. Another exercise I was thinking of is having, the matter of different sort of secrets. So imagine that your protagonist has these secrets that have been put away, and then what's going to happen if somebody finds one of these secrets? What are the consequences going to be? Or what about the day when this character decides can no longer live with themselves to carry this secret alone? Who are they going to tell? And then what's going to happen, right? Or maybe it's a nourished motivation that nobody else knows about this character. That's sort of a stealth motivation. And well, what is it? So thinking about like secrets, I think, can be very useful, because it also can then inform dialogue where someone seems to just be making small talk, but they're really searching after like maybe a key detail to find out about somebody or something. So figuring out, everybody has secrets. What is your main character's secrets? Maybe the protagonist and antagonist, and how can you make the revelation of those secrets? Or maybe they're never really fully revealed to each other. And maybe that's part of the point of the story, is that how keeping these secrets leads to all sorts of interesting complications and conflicts. So I think that's another useful idea to do. And also, well, how far would that character go to keep a secret, right? Which can be a story in itself too. So I think those would be fun exercises perhaps to try, that would get to the sort of the heart of some of the character issues that might impact the plot. Because ultimately I tend to agree that character motivated plot is typically most interesting, right? It's not that you can't have asteroids coming and having to, shoot them off and so forth. Yeah, that can be interesting too, but only so many times, right? And meanwhile, they hopefully have different character motivations for why they're there, other than don't want to die, right?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I really enjoy how much you think outside the box. Because now I'm sitting here thinking to myself, between my male protagonist and my female protagonist, both homicide detectives, I know which one would actually be a murderer, but would they help each other hide the body? And it's just,
Right. So
that would
maybe
be a fun
always on the
short
scene
story to write.
first, because maybe she's modifying things a little bit, or in their discussions, right? One's leading the
Yeah.
other to conclusions. Maybe
Oh, I'm gonna write this short story.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, that could be fun. The duo where the big secret is one of them is the murderer. So that's what you're working on right now?
Yes, yeah, I'm working on a cozy mystery, well, detective fiction. I got 2 different projects going on, but my main one, yeah, Lila could definitely be a murderer. I
So
can see
maybe
that.
one could reveal there's a witness the other one doesn't know about, and then you got to eliminate that witness or intimidate
Yeah.
that, right?
Oh, I'm gonna have fun with this.
I have to admit, that whole thing about putting your protagonist into something where they can't rely on some aspect. And I know you use like Superman and his strength, but even just the idea of like the comedian where the jokes are all bombing, because obviously that would be a crushing blow. I mean, every now and then you watch a comedy show and you're going to hear it's like nothing's landing, there's no laughs, and it's like, how would you feel? How would you react? How would that follow you home when you went home? It's like, would you be like, I am never doing comedy again? Or would it be like, oh, screw those people. They don't know what they're talking about. I'm brilliant. And it's so interesting because I am literally thinking of my characters going, okay, what is the main aspect that kind of not defines them, but is very like one of their strengths? What if I took that away? And I feel like I have to go and write these assignments now. So I feel like I've just been given homework, but it's really exciting homework.
Fun work. Call it fun work.
I was just gonna say, I love how we started this podcast to teach our listeners stuff, but really we interview guests so that we can learn new things about ourselves and our writing. It's, forget the listeners, it's fine.
Actually, I'm curious what you're both working on. So you're doing a detective novel?
Yeah, I have a detective mystery novel in the works, and I'm also working on a separate cozy mystery.
Okay,
But those are my 2 main projects right now.
great.
Well, no, that's a lie. I'm also writing a short story collections told by the Grim
There's
Reaper.
always more.
Yeah, there is
Great.
always more. Yeah.
I was about to jump in and go, what about the other one you just started?
I know. Yeah, I forgot about that already, even though that's the main one I have been working on lately.
Well, that's good. So you can go back and forth in longer and shorter fiction.
Yes. Yeah.
Until she finds something else to add to the list. Because, yeah, exactly.
Don't call me out.
No, I have just finished the first draft of book 1 of my trilogy, which is a traditional fantasy. That's just been alpha read by my partner, so I'll be doing his edits after that, and then I'll send it to the beta. I am working on the 3rd draft of my first book, an urban preternatural fantasy. That's a multi-book series. I have no idea how many books is it, and I am currently writing the first book of possibly a duology, or I might try and cram it all into just one book because I can't keep writing multiple books. And that's just another fantasy series. And then I've got 3 other outlines I'm working on because they're cramming in my back of my head, so they're going to be sorted at the end of the maybe 3rd quarter. I'll work on them. But yeah, that I pivot back and forward between multiple projects because I can't focus on one at a time. My brain isn't like wired that way. I need to work on something and then stop and then work on something else, and then they all start coming together at once. That's how I work.
You mentioned it sounded like 3 different series.
Yeah, I don't do standalone and I don't do short stories. I do like, it's not epic, it's not like Lord of the Rings level, but it's definitely high fantasy. It's a lot of world building. It's stretched over.
Do you know it's gonna be a series at what point when you
almost usually when I'm first like brainstorming and I'm laying out my characters and I start building my world and I realize the plot idea I have, because I have multiple plots. It's like I have a main book plot, and then obviously the series plot or the trilogy plot, but I always have other threads And I usually have multiple main characters because apparently that's what I do. And I've tried so hard to come back to something simple, but I just can't do it.
That's fine. I mean,
So
the
yeah, it's
genre
just
allows for it, right? Expansive
yeah, it
series, you know.
needs when you do big world building, you need space. So I need that. And then I've already drafted the outline for book 2 and 3 of the trilogy. So I kind of already know where it's going and I can kind of feed it back in. So
That's
yeah.
great.
And the other one is just multiple books, because I think it works out at least 14 book ideas. I was pulling all the ideas together and at least 14 plot ideas. So
No shortage of ideas. That's plenty.
no, too many
Yeah.
ideas. Don't you agree, Rachel? Just we just have too many ideas.
I was just gonna say that's the issue. That's the main issue. There's too many ideas. Well, on that note, Jason, it has been fabulous having you on the podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation. I think I can speak for Ari when I say that we learned a lot, and we'll definitely be looking at our manuscripts differently from now on. Please share something about yourselves with our listeners and pimp your book a little bit.
My novella is Master of Rods and Strings, which was it was actually just republished in January 2024 by Crystal Lake Publishing, and it deals with a character who becomes fascinated with the art of occult puppetry, and he gets interested in this because his sister was sort of taken away to this arcane school, and he's both missing her, loves her, but also is jealous that he wasn't selected. And as he gradually learns, the puppetry that's being taught there isn't just about pulling the strings, but all sorts of sorcerous practices. He becomes determined to be the best at such things, to gain vengeance, and he's changed in the process. Innocent, young, a little bit jealous boy, but becoming something somewhat other as time goes on. So it's a book of it's weird fiction, and it was partly inspired by some of the works of Thomas Ligotti, who's very interesting weird fiction writer. I recommend everybody if they haven't engaged with his work yet. So yeah, anyway, just look up Master of Rods and Strings, and I have a website also, jasonmarkharris.com, and I'm on Facebook and Twitter/X and Instagram, and I haven't done much on TikTok. I don't think I'm a singing, dancing person so much. But yeah, so there's that. Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear from people, connect, and I also have some short stories available online, a few different websites where they're like there's one about sleep paralysis, if people are interested in that. There was another one, sort of a sci-fi piece where a strange sort of handle is discovered, and it leads to all sorts of complications in this community when it's discovered to have very strange properties. I have a short story collection under consideration right now, and I've got a novel ready to shop around. That's, I guess, the gist of things right now. There's always more to work on. Screenplays that are ready at some point too, but it's hard to get entry into that world sometimes. Did have a small film produced that was actually an adaptation of a friend who had done a radio play. Again, it's good to explore also to different mediums, I'd suggest, in this world of streaming video and podcasts, certainly, and everything else. So it's a big world out there, and there's a lot of things for writers to do.
There's too many things to do.
Yes,
So we just established.
Yes. We haven't even talked about graphic novels, right? So
Oh yeah, I know. That's a whole nother medium.
right.
Well, thank you again for joining us on the podcast. Again, it was a pleasure to meet you, and this was a really great conversation. All of Jason's links will be in the description below, so please do go check out his work. And in the meantime, we'll turn it over to you guys. Have you ever taken a creative writing course before? And if so, how was it? Or would you consider it if you haven't? Let us know your answers in the comments so we can chat. We release a new episode every Wednesday. Next week, we're discussing writers quitting writing. So to ensure you don't miss it, hit the subscribe button on your way out. As always, thanks for listening to the Merry Writer Podcast. We'll see you next week. This podcast is brought to you by Felt Tip Pens. We love to color code. The music titled Inspired is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons 4.0.